Coalition of 100 Black Women Incorporated, Pennsylvania chapter. I bring you greetings not only on behalf of the Pennsylvania chapter, but on behalf of our national president, Virginia Harris, and the national board and officers. The National Coalition of 100 Black Women Incorporated is an organization that advocates on behalf of Black women and girls, unapologetically, I like to add, also promoting leadership development and gender equity in the areas of health, education, and economic empowerment. You are in for a treat this evening. I will now toss the rest of the evening over to our chair of the Economic Empowerment Committee, Leslie O'Rourke. Again, thank you for joining us, and please visit us on the web at www.nc100bw-pa.org for more information.
Thank you, Madam President. Again, good evening. My name is Leslie O'Rourke, and I am the Economic Empowerment Co-Chair for the National Coalition of 100 Black Women Incorporated, Pennsylvania chapter. And tonight's event, Living Wage, a Human Right, is co-hosted by our Economic Empowerment and Public Policy Committees. So on behalf of our Economic Empowerment Co-Chairs, Nicole Askew and Gwen Williams, and our public policy co-chairs, Hope Foy, Charlita Davis, and Amber Harris, we welcome you here. Before we jump in, I do want to mention a couple of logistical items. We will be streaming this live on Facebook, so we would like all participants here on Zoom to remain on mute. And if you have any questions throughout the discussion or QA section, feel free to add your question to the chat, and I will read them aloud on your behalf. As my husband would say, I am peacock proud and honeymoon happy to be here with you this evening. We know there are several other places that you could be, but you've decided to spend this evening with us discussing the minimum wage crisis. Before we jump into the speaker section, I would like to give us a couple of questions to get us to start thinking about this topic. Did you know that the minimum wage has remained at $7.25 here in Pennsylvania since 2009? And that for tipped workers, the minimum wage is $2.83 an hour? Did you know that this issue disproportionately impacts Black women? Did you know that over time, inflation has eroded the real value of the minimum wage, and that the effectiveness of the buying power of those earning the minimum wage has diminished? But did you know there's something that you can do about it? Our goal with this event is to provide you awareness so that you can take action. No one working 40 hours a week should have to live in poverty. It's as simple as that. During this Sisternomics conversation, you will hear from an organizer, Say Hi To, who will frame the conversation for us and what a living wage is and why she organizes around the issue. You will then hear from Adesola, who is living with this issue or related to this issue, and she will share a story with us. And then we will have Representative Morgan Cephas, who will round out the speaker conversation with information related to how, any work that is related to this issue as it relates to from a legislative perspective. So without further ado, I would like to now pass it to Say Hi To, the organizer.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Again, my name is Sahaitu. Thanks for pronouncing my name properly. People don't always pronounce it properly. I will get into a story about myself and really dive in. But like Leslie mentioned, I'm a political organizer with One Fair Wage. One Fair Wage, we are a national organization. We're advancing policy, driving industry change, and shifting the narrative in order to ensure that all workers in America are paid at least a full minimum wage from their employers. In particular, sub-minimum wages for tipped and other low-wage workers keep millions in poverty and perpetuate sexual harassment. When we talk about the minimum wage, we can also talk about the living wage. We can also talk about the sub-minimum wage. There's like a lot of different wages we're discussing. And as was mentioned by Leslie, kind of like broke it down. But just like basically a living wage is the hourly rate needed to provide the minimum income necessary to pay for basic needs on the cost of living in a specific community. right? And so this is the idea that you're working, 40 hours a week. So, just before this, I had to kind of remind myself, like, what is the living wage? And what's interesting is there's different calculators to figure out what a living wage is. It's all based on, how much food you eat. It's how, if you have children or not, how many parents are in the home, what your rent is, what your expenses are, right? So it's technically like a calculation of sorts. So based on a particular calculator, and I wanted to explain that to everybody because you can do your research and you might find out different numbers, but in particular you can actually find livingwage.mit.edu. They have a particular calculator, and so according to them, the living wage for Pennsylvania is $21.79, right? But on the flip side of that, the poverty wage in PA is actually $6 an hour. So when we say people living in poverty, we're saying that people living in poverty are getting paid $6 an hour. In addition, we already know that the minimum wage in PA is $7.25 an hour. So that's just the base rate that the government's saying you have to pay. And then you add on the sub minimum wage. Right. So I've recently discovered that a lot of people weren't even aware that there was even a sub minimum wage. And so federally, the sub minimum wage is $2.13. And in Pennsylvania, it's $2.83. So essentially, you can have at a restaurant people having a sub minimum wage and the regular minimum wage, or whatever other wage the employer is providing for people. So essentially, it's a two-tiered wage system. And in truth, a two-tiered wage system actually creates poverty and a lot of other issues within different communities. So at the bottom line, what we're really saying is that the minimum wage that we have right now just isn't enough. And I can go into details about myself working a minimum wage job a little bit later. So to be quite honest, I didn't actually have my first job that was getting paid minimum wage until I moved back to Philadelphia, where I worked in a factory sewing. And because the minimum was $7.25, my employer was like, this is what I'm required to pay you. This is what I'm going to pay you. And also just to note too, the living wage for someone without children in the Philadelphia County is actually $12.45. And with a child, it's $25. So when I that living wage originally, which was $21.79, they're kind of averaging it out. But if you have a child, they say you should be getting paid about $25 an hour. And before this, I actually asked a friend who's a single parent. I said, are you making $25 an hour? She said, no, I'm probably making about $8 an hour. So just some numbers to consider. And the real truth of the matter when it comes to the sub-minimum wage, and I want to share specifically sub-minimum wage because the work that we do here at One Fair Wage, it's really breaking down that issue. We're fighting to change federal law, and we're trying to eliminate the sub-minimum wage. Why? Because again, the two-tiered wage system is destructive. And if you really break it down and go back into history a little bit, tipping is actually a legacy of slavery. And that might be a bit of a, where did that come from? How do you know that, right? Just know that tipping is a legacy of slavery, and it actually occurred around the Jim Crow era, when white business owners didn't want to pay Black folks an hourly wage to work. Essentially, they came up with tipping. So now, as a reminder, I don't know if you all know any person who is a tipped worker, and I can kind of dive into who those folks are, right? Of course, we're talking about restaurants, but we're also talking about like delivery drivers. We're talking about food drivers. We're talking about folks who may work at a nail salon, a hair salon, parking lot. So there's a variety of different types of workers. And then specifically in restaurants, you've got your servers, your bartenders, your bussers, right? So there's a lot of workers across America that are getting paid a sub-minimum wage. But to be clear, there's actually 7 states in the US that are already one fair wage states. So we have fought to get one fair wage in 7 states. There's still 43 of them that are not one fair wage states. Now, 70%, I would say 70%, and not me actually, our facts, our research actually says that 70% of tip workers are actually women. And now that's also including folks who are working for your app-based companies, literally like your Instacart, your DoorDash, your Uber, your Lyft. You add in all those different workers, 70% of them are women. So now, since a living base wage is not guaranteed, right? And women are instead, they're forced to depend on their tips, you're going to often find sexual harassment claims in the service industry. And the reality is actually the most sexual harassment is found in the service industry. I mean, of course, if a person has to rely on tips, the likelihood that she may have to do a little bit of flirting to get by, to get, her money, it's just a reality, just to be quite honest. I mean, on top of that, 65% of tip workers are also 24 years old and above. And the median age is about 30 years old. I'm in my 30s. I know many of people who are servers or some type of tip worker, and especially with COVID, right? COVID, and you have these other jobs that you can get that are all in the gig economy. Anybody can be a tip worker because it's great, it's great side money, but you're not always guaranteed those tips. You're not always guaranteed to make that $7.25 minimum wage, right? Also, to add on, more than 30% of tip workers are parents. 30% are parents. So if now COVID is adding on to everything that's happening, and just to keep it really specific to right now, you've got COVID, you have someone going into work, having to see how many guests every day, dealing with people wearing their mask or not wearing their mask, and then they have to go back home with their children, with their family. So what kind of conditions are happening there? So, there's just a lot to think about. And to just be honest, like there were lots of issues in the restaurant industry for tipped workers before COVID, and COVID has just literally made it worse. Again, like I mentioned, I've been a server. I may have mentioned I've been a server. I haven't mentioned I've been a server before. My first experience with the service industry, honestly, was actually organizing service workers in the Honolulu International Airport about 7 years ago. It was my first job out of college. I studied ethnic studies. And so from straight out of college, it was pretty clear that people have power, right? I quickly learned in Hawaii how people went from being indentured servants to holding different positions in office, to making $22 an hour as a bartender, plus tips on top, plus full medical insurance, benefits, all of that stuff. So I already had an understanding of people could fight to get something. And then it wasn't until I came back to Philadelphia about 6 years ago, I actually worked as a server at several restaurants. And that was the first time in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Yeah, I worked for $2.83, right? Only one of the few Black people on the floor, the front of the house. And I experienced that, but I didn't really think about it as like, maybe this has something to do with my race in terms of maybe not getting good shifts, and maybe getting your lunch shifts all the time, not getting that Thursday, Friday. I didn't really want to admit that perhaps it might be because I'm a Black woman, right? Some of our research shows that Black women get paid $5 less an hour than white men, right? So we really think about like tipping as a legacy of slavery. I mean, who does it disproportionately impact? So it's a tough reality for me because I'm like, that does impact me. I'm fortunate enough to have a degree, to have 2 degrees actually. But I did have to get a server job because it was all I could get. And that's the reality for so many people. My situation is really not unique. I would love to introduce one of our workers, shortly. But, in a broader context, just to understand, when I say there are 7 states that are already one fair wage states, what does that mean? That means that we have legislation that passed. And so specifically, if I'm talking about Pennsylvania, right, what are we talking about? We're talking about there's a minimum wage of $7.25. We're talking about there's a sub-minimum wage. We're currently fighting to eliminate that sub-minimum wage, right, and get everybody at a realistic minimum wage, which would be $15 an hour. So we currently have a one fair wage bill that's sitting since last year, March. And just in September 30th, Chris Rabb actually introduced a much more enhanced one fair wage bill that would include those who've been disabled, that would include those in the gig economy, and that would include those who have been incarcerated. Patty Kim is another person who has sponsored it. In addition, we have elected officials like Senator Hughes, Haywood, that are in support of everything, of what we're doing. They understand that, we need people to be living on a living wage and not a minimum wage. The minimum wage is just a bare minimum. That was the purpose of it way back decades ago, was to just give a base level, because if we can't forget, America was based on slavery. So let's not assume that the strategy is going to be, let's pay people a lot of money, right? And to be really specific too, there's major players that keep the minimum wage, keep the sub minimum wage existing because they benefit off of it. Because if they don't have to pay their workers that much money, they can make more money. Anybody who's in business knows the bottom line, it's labor, right? So one of those 3 organizations actually that make sure the law stays the way they are is the Darden Group. September 30th, the same day, we started a litigation against the Darden Group, one fair wage against the Darden Group, because they lobby. They spend millions of dollars to make sure the federal sub-minimum wage stays the way it is, and they make sure that minimum wage stays nice and low. So we're asking that no worker be left behind in the work that we do. On top of that, we're asking that get informed, right? A lot of times we're encouraging folks to get that degree, do all those things. I got 2 degrees, one in ethnic studies, one in business. That did not shield me from having a minimum wage job or a sub-minimum wage job. And had COVID not happened, I would not have really accepted the reality that like systematic racism really does exist, and it's really gonna mess me up. And I mean, that's probably why I am a labor organizer. I got into this specific work here at One Fair Wage earlier in March. And to be honest, it was either a job at back in labor, a service industry job. And I honestly was just like, can I do this again? Do I want to do this again? Do I want to play these games again? Because I know my rights. I know my rights. I know to keep someone in the office with me when I'm talking to my manager, right? I kind of accepted that, hey, I just don't have the experience to get all those great shifts. But I didn't really want to do that. So I went into One Fair Wage work. And since then, I've just learned so much. And now I'm learning how important it is to actually educate people on that basic side of, your server who's giving you food at an Applebee's or Red Lobster is literally getting paid $2.83. And it's important to know your right, also to even know that you can debate that rate. Also, just to highlight, COVID has made it really bad. About 60% of tip workers have really been struggling to even get unemployment due to the way you report your tips, right? A lot of folks who are tip workers, they come back with a check that's zero. How can you determine how much money that person made if their check is turning out to be zero, right? So a couple things to kind of consider, besides, of course, the health and the safety of folks currently working right now. Let's see, I want to make sure I've kind of addressed a lot of different things in here. Let me just make sure, just to be really specific to how you can get involved. Just this past Saturday, we were out in Harrisburg for Early Voter Day, really wanting to make sure folks know that, hey, tips workers are out here. In the past, they've often been left out of legislation. They've been left out of the conversation when it comes to election time. We need more Democrats in office, right? We just need more Democrats to push this. We need people to vote. We need people to understand that a lot of your friends, a lot of your family members, a lot of your close people around you are getting tipped, and it ain't cutting it. So ways that you can get involved, we're always running some type of petition, always trying to inform folks. We're always running some type of volunteer program, right? And if you have any type of organizations that you're working with, we're always open to have these kind of conversations, really just to educate people. Because sometimes that opening conversation is tipping to legacy of slavery. Do you want to perpetuate the systematic racism? I think I don't want to keep going. I honestly want to just kind of jump over to Adesola. If it's okay with you, Leslie, I would love to introduce her. And, my story, look, I'm fortunate to have a full-time job right now and be speaking on behalf of One Fair Wage. But more importantly, I really like you to talk to or listen to someone who's working in the industry, one of our worker leaders that I met through this work. Really, really, really awesome person, talented person, and has unfortunately had to deal with a lot during COVID. So please, I'd like to introduce Adisola.
Yes, welcome.
Hi, thanks. Say hi too. My name is Adisa, and I'm a Nigerian immigrant. I'm on DACA, and I've been in the service industry for 15 plus years, spanning from DC, North Carolina, and now Philadelphia. This has been a very interesting time for me, especially in this world right now with everything that's going. I feel like a lot of my identities are at a really weird intersection with everything going on with SARS in Nigeria, then DACA being repealed and not repealed, and then it's just like one thing after another. So it's been very difficult, and also like having those identities, because I also represent as queer. And then working in the service industry, there's already so many things are against you as a Black woman in the industry. For me, I've had my own like business. I'm constantly in managerial positions, but I'm also usually overworked and underpaid because people will see, okay, you have this, you're the only one doing this. Well, we're gonna just keep pushing things on you and let other things go. Or if I speak up and I say something, I'm fired, like I was with a really big company in Philadelphia. There was a white man who was predatory towards all the younger women who were there, and I said something about it, and I kept bringing it up. And then another customer came in, they were racist towards one of my employees. I got written up because I defended my Black coworker, you know, and then I eventually got fired from that place. It's things like that that just keep repeating themselves. And this predatory white man basically got promoted, which is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen in my life. And then as a server, you have to deal with, well, I personally have to deal with, say hi to mention this, like sometimes you just don't know what you're going to like walk out with. I know I worked at a very popular restaurant in Philadelphia, and they do this a lot where they'll hire people of color and Black people just to be like, hey, look at what we did. We ticked off the boxes for you, you know? And then they shove us into shifts that we don't get paid anything. I personally was shoved into those lunch shifts where maybe I walk out with $20 that shift, and that was 4 of my shifts a week, you know? Or the assistant manager will come up to me and say very derogatory things about me, ask me if I wash my hair, and I can't say anything to her. That's my manager, you know? And it's just been a really hard and difficult road, because I also now, on top of having struggled to like make my bills, working how many hours, servers work long hours. I'm a diabetic, so that's rough on my body already. And now I have to work 2-3 jobs on top of that to pay for my medicine, make sure I'm not overworking my body. It's like that balance of like, I need to work, but if I work too much, I will literally collapse on the floor. You know, I have to be really self-conscious about my health. But then I also have to save up for things like DACA, which is $500 every year now. It used to be biannual, but Trump changed it to every year. So now I have to think about that $500 bill that's waving over my head every time, plus the lawyer fees that go on top of that for them to help you file it. So it's just one layer on top. And because I am a diabetic, I actually can't go back to work. You know, I can't go back because my safety is my health. If I go back, I don't know what's going to happen. So I've been relying on like my friends, and my friends like did a fundraiser for me and things like that. But like, I also don't qualify for unemployment. So, but I'm also super happy that I'm not in this rat race anymore, because I feel like there was a system that we were all like just fed of like, this is what it's supposed to be like. And because a lot of people were so afraid, no one wanted to push against it, but it's been a really beautiful thing to watch people actually stand up and try and fight against everything that's happening. Um, and I would really, really like to see some more change and some more people actually putting some actionable things, especially as we push towards the election. And what are our plans that we're going to do that spreads out from, okay, let's help people like myself, like my mom. You know, I have I'm not close to my family. My mom barely gets by. She's by herself in Arizona. She lost her job as soon as COVID hit, and that's a Black woman. She was the first person let go. So she also has been struggling by herself across the country. So I would like to see more things in place, that we are not in the struggle bus anymore as Black women trying to like really get, because we're usually the hardest working people in anywhere we are, any industry we're in. We're always the people doing the work. And I would like to see us compensated and paid for the work in our time. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing, Adesola. I think it was very powerful. Something that my husband says from an organizing perspective is, it's really important to hear from people who are closest to the pain because they're the closest to the solution. So I really appreciate you sharing your story with us, because I think we definitely need to hear stories like yours, especially as we start to think about how we as an organization can help and partner with organizations like One Fair Wage and that Say Hi, and the work that Say Hi To is doing. So I really do appreciate both of you ladies for sharing. Now we will move to State Representative Morgan Cephas to kind of talk to us a little bit about, what can we do and how can we fit in as like an organization or as individuals to really see a change from a legislative perspective.
So first and foremost, I want to thank the coalition for just having this conversation. I think as we crawl to election day, it's more important now, more than ever, to talk about these issues and to talk about what is at stake, not just for the city of Philadelphia, but for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in this country. I think, when you have, it's interesting because, we've been talking about these issues, since the beginning of time, that we need to protect individuals on the ground. We've been talking about the role that Black women play across this country, whether it be being the backbone of the Democratic Party or the backbone of our society. The fact that when we come to the table, we don't just come to the table with ourselves, we come to the table with our entire community. So, it's great that we are talking about the minimum wage, but one of the things that we try to do on the state level is to really debunk what is the minimum wage worker. For some reason, our Republican colleagues, and I know this is not a partisan issue, but we do have people in Harrisburg that believes that the majority of minimum wage workers are African-American women that are single moms. And that is just simply not the case. It's either African-American single moms or the high school student that is a junior in high school that relies on a minimum wage. And I think, it just remains critical for us to really debunk those myths. So before I continue on, I just first want to thank One Fair Wage and the coalition for just making this a priority and really honing in down to the last wire, why this upcoming election is important. So with that, I want to be able to transition over to a PowerPoint presentation that I created just to provide some statistics, talk about what's happening up in Harrisburg and what work we need to do. One of the things I know we are in a crisis at this time with COVID-19, with, the economic downturn, the civil unrest, but right now is the time where our voices are needed most, because every time that there's a crisis, we truly have an opportunity to reimagine and to re-envision what the future of this country looks like. And I think the decisions that we're going to make on November 3rd will determine, do we create a country from the ground up, or do we continue this narrative around this whole idea of a trickle down theory that we know does not work for family and friends that are, with working families that are on the ground. And I'll end with this before I go over into the PowerPoint presentation, but we all know tip wage workers. We all know, or even have experience. I mean, I know I have my own experience being in college, working at Old Navy, which is, a big corporate business, working for minimum wage. And the fact that I am sure that that store used tax credits, literally using corporate welfare in order for their businesses to thrive, but also doing it on the back of workers. So that's something that we have to remember, is that we all have these lived experiences, and we have to make policy decisions and resource investments and elect individuals that are going to want to create that different pathway that, again, is working for working families. So let me go ahead and go to the PowerPoint. Okay, fantastic. Okay, are we good to go? All right, perfect. So first and foremost, again, I want to, just highlight who is the minimum wage worker. And based on statistics here in Pennsylvania, we know that the average, the stereotype again is that it's either an African-American woman that's a single mom, or it's a teenager who's working part-time after school, lives with their parents, and is just simply doing it to get additional spending money. But in reality, and again, this is something that we have to stress, I am the only African-American woman that sits on the Labor and Industry Committee up in the General Assembly. And I literally had to give my colleagues a bit of an education. And the reality of the minimum wage worker is that the average age is 37 years old. 90% are not teens. 37% are 40 years old or older. 60% are women. 25% have children. And interestingly enough, 80% of minimum wage workers are white. So to be able to tell that narrative around who we are really fighting for just reinforces the importance of Black women being at the table. Because again, we do not just come to the table with our issues, we are trying to uplift communities. And we all know the impact this has on families. We know as our minimum wage stays stagnant, you see that states around us, I want to say roughly states around us essentially have gone up in their minimum wage as Pennsylvania again stays stagnant. But we all know inflation exists. So the impact to families with the minimum wage it impacts their ability to buy groceries, to afford transportation, to afford housing. And we all understand the critical needs this essentially has created, especially during the impact of COVID-19. And, I already mentioned to corporate welfare when, yes, I'm beyond excited to have Amazon and Walmart increase their minimum wages, but we all know $15 an hour is just scratching the surface. When you think of the tax breaks and the state grants that companies like Walmart, like Amazon have gotten, we have a series of hotels in the city of Philadelphia that, One Fair Wage has been, taken to task. We recognize how much corporate welfare we are giving them, but the fact that they are not in turn paying their workers, just reinforces how much we are giving away. Because when companies do not pay their workers a fair wage, that then means the taxpayer in the state has to come in with additional resources. So that's why we call that corporate welfare. And last but not least is when you think of our COVID-19 frontline workers. These are workers that are again, not new to us, but new to so many that we relied heavily on during this COVID-19 pandemic. We're talking about our restaurant workers, our retail workers, our grocery store workers, all who had to fight essentially tooth and nail just to get proper PPE, to get proper paid sick leave. Literally, these men and women are helping this country to continue to move during this pandemic. And the fact that we cannot pay them and that we are not paying them is truly a travesty. So what are we doing up in Harrisburg? We're doing a couple of things. You all know it is a Republican controlled General Assembly. So we are battling up a hill every single time we are up there. But luckily we have, again, organizations like the Coalition, organizations like One Fair Wage, where we really pushed to ensure that Governor Wolf, during every single budget proposal, made this a priority. And as much as we want it to be a priority, again, when we are in a Democratic controlled General Assembly, it does take both houses to move legislation along like this. So just, this past year, we literally had our governor make a proposal of doing $12 an hour and getting it to $15 an hour by January 2024. And as we all know, we know this is not the fair wage actually that, based on inflation, we literally should be up in the 20s. But this is just, again, scratching the surface and trying to, get this number up as much as possible. And with the governor's proposal, we've literally would have had 93,000 Pennsylvanians off Medicaid, which is, saving taxpayer money, allowing us to divert it to other issues like education, climate change, things of that nature. And we additionally, and this is one thing that some of my colleagues don't like to talk about, is that when you put more money in the pockets of families, it essentially is a revenue generator. We literally, with the governor's proposal, would have generated $300 million in state tax revenue. And again, that revenue goes into other areas of interest that are really important to working families. So there was a compromise in the Senate. We had Senate Bill 79, which was led by State Senator Tartaglia, which unfortunately made a proposal from $7.50 to $9.50, and that is in January 2020. It would have helped 385,000 workers, but it passed the Senate. It did not get out of the House. And sadly to say, we understand that that would have been a raise for some workers, but that's just not good enough. And so essentially it failed in the House. The great thing also is that this is not a new issue. As the previous presenters mentioned, you have Representative Chris Rabb, Representative Malcolm Kenyatta. I want to say you have Maria Donatucci, you have Patty Kim, that have all put together a very bold vision that doesn't just focus on the dollar amount. So in their original proposal, it was House Bill 1215. They wanted to take it from $12 to $15 over a certain number of years, but also to adjust it to inflation. So we're not having this conversation following the next year when, yes, you're giving me $15, but then my gas costs, the cost of milk goes up. So we want to ensure that it's adjusted to inflation. And that's what was incorporated in the bill as well. They also, and I know previous presenters talked about increasing tip wage workers. So that was also discussed. Last but not least, which was, one of the other key parts of the bill, was eliminating credit card process fees. Believe it or not, restaurant owners, they tend to pass that on to the wait staff in order to, not incur that cost themselves. So eliminating that. Last but not least, we had our colleague, State Representative Boyle, who was interested in, if we can't for some reason get one fair wage across the state, how about we look at allowing local municipalities to implement legislation that would allow them to set their own minimum wage. As you know, minimum wage should be different in Philadelphia than it is in York County. And these are, just conversations that are happening. And I think the great thing is that we're in a crisis. And when we crawl out of this thing, we really need to have bold ideas. So the next slide, and I'm going to wrap it up after this one, is, some of the roadblocks that we're experiencing in the General Assembly. Believe it or not, and I know this is not a partisan conversation, but some of my colleagues still are under the impression that we don't need to increase these wages because it's primarily high school students, and this wage should not be a family sustaining wage. But failing to realize when you just have an economy where you don't have a strong set of jobs in the middle, but you have retail jobs and then high paying jobs, you have to figure out what policies that we need to put in place so we can ensure families can, maintain a quality life, but also move along the economic spectrum. But they also believe the impact to employers, that it would increase in unemployment, it would decrease in wages, be significant high turnover as a result of increase in this wage. And the sad part is, yes, you will get every state rep, every state senator out of southeastern Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and all the surrounding counties understanding that you need to make $30,000 at the bare minimum here in Philadelphia in order to even live a quality of life. But when you go to Republican counties like Luzerne County, Beaver County, Butler County, their constituents are making less than $10 an hour, and not recognizing that their legislators are voting against increasing their wages. That is the heart-wrenching part, is that each of these counties that I have up here are Republican led and should be at $23, $24 an hour. And their state representatives and senators are not advocating for them here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that's why this upcoming election is extremely important, because when you are at the table, whoever is at the table, and I'm sure you've heard this from the great Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, whoever is at the table dictates the menu. And as we crawl out of COVID-19, we have to ensure, first of all, Black women are already at the table because we're bringing up our chairs, we're knocking down doors, so we're already there. But the important thing is that we have to get others there, and I say that because we have $1.6 billion that we still have to spend in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania around COVID-19 funding. Again, we have an election coming up. We have a midterm budget that is coming up where we will be making decisions on who we want to protect. And that question comes down to, do we want to protect big business and think that it's going to eventually trickle down to working families? Or do we want to focus on working families and small businesses that are helping the neighborhoods and the communities that we come from? So I ask you, as a marching orders, yes, this is the end of our legislative season, so all bills are essentially going to die. But once we come back into session December 1, raising our voices, calling our elected officials to ensure that a minimum wage increase in any conversation that we have needs to be a priority. And again, it cannot just be what the Republicans propose, $7.50 to $9.50. It has to be a very bold ask. And of course, they're going to chisel us down. And if they're going to chisel us down, why not ask for $25 an hour and then adjust it to inflation? Because you're going to chisel us down anyway. But I do think, for this organization, I've just seen so many amazing things happen as a result of the coalition raising their voices. I saw what you were able to do with helping our chairwoman, Joanna McClinton, get her human trafficking bill across the line. And it really took the voices that come to this table for the coalition. And I think we are just going to need your voices again to help drive home that we need to make working families a priority as we move out of COVID-19. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I'm sure I went over time. Elected officials, we talk. So thank you for having me, and again, having this conversation. We are several days away from this election, and just so many things, as we all know, are on the ballot, from healthcare to, again, small businesses, to minimum wage, and continuing to have these conversations to further reinforce what is at stake is going to make the difference. So thank you again for having me. I will unshare my screen and I'll be here for questions.
Awesome. Wow. I'm just in wow of all three speakers. I'm like, that was super powerful. I think that like knowledge is power. So we appreciate the power that we've received this evening. We appreciate all three because you gave us different perspective from say hi to framing it and telling us why this even, why is this even an issue? Where does it come from? Why is it important? And then hearing from someone who is actually living it today. And then to hear from State Representative Cephas on what can we do about it, and what have we tried to do about it that hasn't been successful, and how do we all individually get involved so that next legislative period we can make some change. So really just timely information. I think some folks in the chat said it, and I think it was stated in someone's presentation as well that this is very timely given that we're in the election season. So definitely appreciate it. Now we want to address any questions that are in the chat. So I saw a couple come through as we were discussing certain topics. So one of the first question that we received, and I don't know who wants to take this, but the question is, how does the latest push for legalizing recreational use of marijuana play into fair or livable wage? Is there an opportunity for it to be attached to this push? And I think that was related to the push of legislation.
So I'll go ahead and jump in there. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge, one of my mentors, Wilhelmina Moore, who sat me down and had a conversation about marijuana usage. And she talked about that there needing to be a multi-layer approach to bringing this type of program online in Pennsylvania. You have multiple generations that look at the marijuana differently. They've had significant different experiences, but we also know that states have literally been able to climb out of debt as a result of it. So it absolutely is a revenue generator and will be for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We also know that the decriminalization of marijuana is extremely significant, especially with the police force and their targeting of Black and Brown communities. They are disproportionately impacted by marijuana and it being illegal. So we recognize that that is an issue. But last and final, just listening to Wilhelmina Moore is that we really have to sit down and have a conversation to see, and again, this is my perspective. I am not a full proponent of it yet, because again, we do have to work out of the kinks. We have to talk through what happens when we have communities that don't want the distribution of marijuana sold in their individual communities. I've actually had a community in the Winfield section of West Philadelphia actually stand up and protest. We are literally fighting a medical marijuana dispensary as we speak. But we also know, again, communities that might not want it. So how do we balance that? How do we balance individuals' records? For me, I need you to expunge records starting from 1776, because as you know, again, Black and Brown communities have been disproportionately impacted by this. And I think the last piece is how are small businesses, or how are Black and Brown businesses going to be able to take advantage of an industry that could generate billions of dollars. So I think as we talk about this industry, even though it could be a pathway for so many Black and Brown people in different communities, how do we bring this industry online in an equitable way, to where again we are able to take advantage of it economically, but then also we are addressing past indiscretions with records and doing it in a responsible way, so we don't add yet another barrier for individuals to acquire work because of the controlled substance in their system. So I think it's a very nuanced conversation. But if you talk to some of my other colleagues, a lot of them are, let's go. But I think it's very nuanced, and it could lend and be helpful with minimum wage and things like that. But again, it's a conversation.
And Morgan, I just want to say too, everything you said was fantastic. And just to urge the conversation, No one's going to stop the legal businesses from operating and hiring people and paying them a minimum wage. And if you really examine some of the businesses, it's the service industry, it's service. And so if we don't have the conversation, businesses will continue to exploit people, keep Black and brown out of those jobs, and we're just not talking about it.
Wow, thank you both. All right, so the next question, and I think this is going to be another tricky question, but the question is, who are the state senators and state representatives who voted against the increase, and how can we address them right now and let them know this is unacceptable? So I think that was again for you, State Representative Cephas, in terms of those that are voting against some of the legislation that is around increasing the minimum wage to something more livable.
So the challenge is a lot of the bills that have been offered haven't even been able to get a committee vote or have come to the floor. So we don't technically have a record of who's voting against it. We just know that there's one party blocking even just having a conversation about it. And the only bill that has actually come up and gotten out of a chamber or has gotten a vote, that is Senate Bill 79. And that is the bill that was, I believe it was co-authored by Senator Tartaglione and a Republican. I'm not sure what the vote total was for that bill, but it did get out of the Senate. And again, because we don't control, that's what happens when whoever's in control of the chamber dictates what the voting calendar is. The voting calendar, what even comes up for a vote. So because the Republicans in the general on the House side aren't interested in increasing the wage, especially during an election year, they wouldn't even allow us to have a conversation about it in committee. But I definitely can pull up the record on the Senate side to see who did not vote for it.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, honestly, that was the last, but there were only 2 questions. So that's awesome. I guess you all did a wonderful job conveying your message, and there weren't a ton of questions, but I echo the sentiments of most of my coalition sisters here in the chat that just are thanking you all for, presenting and giving such insight and bringing the issue to life. So again, I want to thank the speakers and thank everyone that was able to join. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we will be having a survey link that comes out. So please be on the lookout for that so that we can gather your feedback. But on behalf of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women Incorporated Pennsylvania chapter, Naisha Chapman, our first vice president, and Latifah Fields, our president, we thank you for joining, and we hope that you have a wonderful evening. Take care.